Conspiracy, cock-up, or inevitability. Whatever the reasons, the result was that on the 15th of April, car making at Longbridge ended. We've all seen the headlines about management paychecks, but this isn't a story of bosses running a company for mere personal gain. It's one of naivety, missed opportunities, and plain bad decisions. Yet, just before the closure, things had been looking up. It seemed the bosses were a whisker away from an agreement with the Chinese car giant Shanghai Automotive, a deal to secure thousands of British jobs and catapult MG Rover into the big time. They claimed the Chinese were just 20 minutes away from finally signing on the dotted line. The press was summoned here, to the boardroom at Longbridge, to await the announcement. I can remember the day. The entire motor industry were holding their breath. It was to be the culmination of over a year's worth of painstaking negotiation.
I'd get daily updates from one of the bosses to how the deal was going.
One man, a senior insider at MG Rover for 5 years, agreed to talk now only if we concealed his identity. While the workers waited for good news from China, he had doubts about the way the talks were going.
They found the Chinese very difficult to deal with. I think they were actually much smarter than the British team. I was told they'd spend all day talking about precisely where their comma should go in the contract. They were very shrewd and smart.
As the various updates filtered in from Shanghai, he felt his colleagues were struggling to close the deal.
The MG Rover team found themselves completely outgunned by the business brain of the Chinese. The Chinese had an incredible work ethic.
And he wasn't the only one concerned, as I found out. This is the $1 million McLaren F1, the world's fastest road car. And this is its celebrity designer, Peter Stevens. He was hired by MG Rover to help give their models a facelift and was in China for some of the negotiations. While there, Stevens saw firsthand how the host did business with the men from Longbridge.
We went to have a banquet of fascinating, magic things to eat, very interesting. There was a drink called Maltai, which people drink there in a small glass that you can kind of clasp in your hand and throw it back. And I was looking at the Chinese people opposite, and they weren't throwing it back. They were doing all that shouting and yelling and throwing the glass in the air, but they weren't actually drinking it. And I've watched even more carefully, and when it came to the wine, you know, they would be holding the glass as wine was supposed to be put. You know, they weren't drinking, but they were doing all the play acting of being drunk, you know, and leaning about and stuff. And then after midnight, it was to repair to the bar to begin negotiations, you know. I thought that was crap, quite honestly.
So, were negotiations done for the future of MG Rover while everybody was slaughtered?
It would be wrong to say they were slaughtered, but I think the Chinese would have given themselves an advantage there.
Conviviality can be used as a weapon. You find you're drinking, you're toasting every full stop, every comma, and then to your horror, you realize that your hosts are not, by which time you're too far gone. But then you've got to be careful that you don't get yourself into a position where you are going to sign away the crown jewels or say something you're going to regret in the future.
But even if they were stone cold sober, there was cause for regret, because at the end of last year they signed away the rights for MG Rover's car designs. The aim was to get the Chinese to sign a joint venture, pumping £250 million into Longbridge and securing its future. But they apparently sold the Chinese the rights to make Rovers in Shanghai for just £67 million before the main deal had been done.
Was that a very, very bad business decision to give that stuff away before you'd even signed the deal?
It'd be probably comparable to putting a condom on after sex.
So why did they do that?
I wasn't there, I don't know what happened, but it does seem an extraordinary thing to do. Because thereafter the Chinese negotiating position was, to put it mildly, strong.
And the Chinese exploited that position fully. As far as they were concerned, they'd got what they really wanted, the precious MG Rover design rights. But in return, there'd be no joint venture, No £250 million investment, and no future for Longbridge.
As negotiators, do you think they were out of their depth when they went to Shanghai, the Phoenix 4?
Well, the evidence would seem to be that they probably were. Somebody left there with a clear victory and somebody with a clear defeat, and it was pretty obvious which was which.
Instead of announcing an historic joint venture, a government minister had to rewrite her speech.
Tonight, MG Rover has announced that the board has decided to call in the receivers. This is a devastating blow.
The failed deal spelled the end for the 4 local businessmen who'd arrived at Longbridge as heroes. Previous owners, BMW, were on the verge of closing the loss-making plant when the so-called Phoenix 4 stepped in. They paid just £10 for it and were seen as saviours.
When they took over the organisation, it was fantastic. And I moved there along with lots of other people that didn't know whether we'd got jobs or managers or what we were doing. But basically, I was amazed by the place. The place has got an amazing atmosphere.
I can remember standing in the room at Longbridge, the huge press conference when John Towers and the other members of the Phoenix consortium came to the factory to sort of say, we've done it, we've bought it, we've paid the £10 sort of thing. And I think all of us standing there were saying, yeah, great, good on you, well done. And there was huge, almost hysteria on the lines that, you know, it was going to be okay now. But I think at the back of our minds we were thinking, but what's going to happen in the future?
But who exactly were the Phoenix 4, and how qualified were they to run such an important British car company? Who better to tell us than those on the inside? This man headed MG Rover's Shanghai team during the last 6 months.
Nick Stevenson was an engineer at Rover for years, and for what I know he was a good engineer, but he's not a businessman. He's a nice guy who likes fast cars. The faster the better. A total petrolhead.
This man went from running the car showroom set up by his father to promoting MG Rover worldwide.
His heart was absolutely in the MG and Rover business. You know, I think this disaster which we've seen has actually probably affected him harder than the others because he did have such a passion for it.
Our third Phoenix had probably the lowest profile.
Peter Beale was John Edwards' accountant at Stratford-on-Avon, and a good friend of his. He was the money man.
But the fourth was the consortium's public face, the man on whom the workers' hopes rested.
John Towers was the front man. He'd been a senior executive at Rover before, so he was probably the most qualified. But in the 5 years I was there, Towers wasn't around very much.
He was the most experienced of the 4, and when the chairman did turn up, he could play a blinding round.
John Towers we didn't see a lot of. When we did, he was a very incisive thinker, actually. He would come to some board meetings and he'd listen to all kinds of ramblings on and explanations and things, and he could cut right to the real heart of a problem and say, you know, yes, but why the hell are we doing that?
Former colleagues have told us the new bosses referred to themselves as 4 Brummies with an overdraft. And there was soon another member. Kevin Howe was made chief executive to run the company day to day. The Phoenix 4 became 5.
He's immaculate, the opposite to John Edwards. Not a hair out of place person. He had a very aggressive reputation in the factory. He'd run the production line at Rover for years.
The team had a famous brand and a shed load of money. They hadn't just bought Longbridge for a tenner. BMW also handed them more than £1 billion in cash and assets. But they'd bought a loss-making plant with too many workers and a history of producing bad cars, and little time to work out how they'd turn it round.
They didn't have weeks or months. They had hours. They walked in, they had no plan, they had no strategy, and they had no idea of how on earth they were going to turn it into a viable business.
John Moulton was a rival bidder for Rover. His plans would have cost 5,000 jobs.
Longbridge will be reduced in size but not closed.
When Phoenix pledged to save those jobs, he was certain they were doomed.
I would have given it 100 to 1 against Santane any bet at that level. And it's not very satisfying to say so. They were pursuing a hopeless business strategy. Mass market producer, smallest plant in Europe, obsolete models, weak distribution. I mean, it just didn't hang together. They haven't got a chance.
Experts were convinced there was only one way to save MG Rover, and that was to spend the money BMW had left them to come up with better cars.
They desperately needed to develop new models. This is life and death. So every last asset, every last ounce of resource needs to be put into developing models.
Who wants to be a millionaire? I don't have flashy...
But development costs money, lots of it. BMW may have left them $1 billion plus, but in the car world that's a raindrop in an ocean. So instead of coming up with the new cars, they redesigned the old. There was some clever facelifting of the 25, 45 and 75 models. Then Rovers were transformed into sexy MGs. Yesterday's lunch had been nicely reheated for today's breakfast. Recycled even.
We became known as the world champions of recycling vehicles.
Brian Miles's design studio got used to working miracles with a budget more suited to loaves and fishes.
We had ideas which were beyond the budgets at that time for Rover. Metalwork could not be changed, so we were adding on plastic parts, new bumpers, new trim, some new interior parts. So we prettied the vehicles up on a very small budget.
There were signs of chaos on the production line as supply orders changed day by day.
We were asked to produce a new bumper. We were told at the beginning that they wanted 5 bumpers per week, and within a few weeks this went to 200 a week. If there was a plan, I don't know how many people were actually working to it.
Simply revamping old models did nothing for the company's overall sales figures. They were still losing money and their £1 billion was dwindling fast. If MG Rover was to survive long term, it couldn't do it alone.
It cost hundreds and hundreds of millions of pounds to develop one car, never mind a whole range. So their task was huge. What it needed was a partner, and it needed a partner very quickly. That takes some finding.
So the Phoenix 5 clearly knew they needed someone else's money to help bankroll the future of MG Rover. So you would have thought they'd spend all their time and energy finding that crucial, life-saving partnership. Well, actually, no. 6 months after the takeover, they decided to go racing.
After 30 years away from motorsport, they launched a multi-million-pound plan to put MG back on the racetrack. Junior World Cup rallying, the British Touring Car Championships, and most expensively of all, the Le Mans Endurance Race. They were going for it. Now racing's exciting, it's glamorous, and it gets you noticed. It also eats millions for breakfast. Millions the MG team could ill afford.
They had a tiny budget, a tiny company. So they went back to racing, but it had to be done on a shoestring budget. They wanted the maximum amount of bang for the minimum input. And what you have to do then is cobble together a program.
They hired professionals to help strike sponsorship deals, but it quickly became clear they were innocents in the racing world.
There was a massive muddle in terms of what they were trying to do, and there was no clear direction as to where the motorsport programme was going.
But did you ever feel that they were out of their depth when it came to motorsport?
Very out of their depth. I think they should have taken notice of more people that they actually employed. You know, they had Mark Blundell. Yeah, fantastic.
That's right, Mark Blundell, voice of Formula One and former Le Mans winner. The bosses brought him in as a driver and advisor. He liked them personally, but professionally was less than impressed.
The biggest contact for me was John Edwards and Nick Stevenson, and those guys were great guys. To be honest with you, I think the problem was that there was disarray, and there was disarray at so many different levels, and there was no answers coming from any particular level that you could never get a decision made. They thought they were going to turn up at Le Mans, big splash, do 24 hours of racing, have a result and walk away. It doesn't work like that. They never actually allocated enough money to go along and do the testing and do the legwork because they didn't know. They had no experience from day one of what was required.
Amazingly, while MG Rover Motorsports needed more money, the bosses were happy to pass up offers of cash. Potential sponsors found they couldn't give their money away.
I thought it might be interesting to meet a man who tried to offer Rover a 6-figure sum in sponsorship. I say tried.
I must have made probably a couple of phone calls to their motorsport management department, spoke to who I thought was the senior guy there, said he was interested and would get back to me. And he said he'd get back to me. And he said he'd get back to me.
The waiting went on. After 2 months, he wrote to MG Rover Chief Executive Kevin Howe, underlining his disappointment at their lack of interest. Howe wrote back saying other business had pushed his ideas into the background.
I found their attitude somewhat strange because usually companies such as ours are courted assiduously by a number of companies for sponsorship.
Lawrence eventually found someone at MG Racing to take his money, but even 6-figure sums didn't last long. There was one thing, though, on the racing circuit the Rover guys did excel at: hospitality. Here, it seemed, no expense was spared.
Tom and Kit arrived by helicopter and they did a live performance in the hospitality suite for all the guests. It was fantastic. There was live music, it was open 24 hours a day, they built their own hotel, and it was 300 metres down the park. It was fantastic. I mean, you know, it was amazing.
Private planes to the Le Mans, hotels being erected at Le Mans with our brand on the hotel, a lot of hospitality, but it struck me it was more jolly than business. It didn't strike me it was any more than an excuse for a very good party.
They did spend an awful lot of money. They put on a fantastic show and almost beat Audi. Not in the racing, but in terms of the show that they put on behind the scenes.
On the track, there was enormous public support for the MG team.
It's a huge feeling because Le Mans is special in its own right. You've got 80,000 to 100,000 Brits travel across like a pilgrimage every year. But when MG said they were coming back to racing, all of a sudden, those 80,000 people, you know, half of them are at least wearing something connected with MG. And by the time you get to the actual race itself, you're walking on air.
But despite all the razzmatazz, MG Rover were out of the race by halfway, overshadowed by much richer rivals.
At the end of all of it, Audi also had a $50 million budget to run their cars on the circuit. MG Rover did not. And, you know, that's probably the biggest issue in terms of what people then saw perception-wise. They looked at it and went, they've spent all their budget on entertainment, they've done nothing with the cars. In motorsport, that's a no-no.
The hangover from an underfunded motorsport programme was huge, and it wasn't just because of the extensive hospitality. You had disaffected drivers, cars in the pits, and sponsors ready to take their money elsewhere. Even then, the Phoenix bosses just couldn't get it right.